Well, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to attend USENIX, never had the opportunity. I'm with Argonne National Laboratory just outside Chicago. And I should offer the standard weasel disclaimer that the views expressed in this talk are my own. They should not necessarily be ascribed to Argonne National Laboratory, the United States Department of Energy, or anybody who's sensible. I work with the vulnerability assessment team there, and we've done hundreds of different vulnerability assessments on a wide variety of different physical devices, systems, and programs. And as a result, we've seen a lot of dumb security practice. And the type of dumbness we see tends to fall into three major categories. There's the inadvertent errors, the sort of forgetting to lock the door. And that can have serious security implications, but I'm not sure that we have anything profound to offer as a countermeasure. Then there are those people and organizations that are clearly too stupid to ever have good security. And these are beyond hope and help and not worth worrying about. But I really think that's a very small minority. The bigger problem, in my view, are the people and the organizations that, in theory, have plenty of intelligence and common sense to have good security, but simply don't exploit it. And I'll talk a little bit about at the end about why that might be. But let's be clear, the point in pointing out these stupid security mistakes is not to make fun of people and feel superior. That's just a fringe benefit. The real purpose of this is to try to understand why security is so often highly ineffective. And I like to try to understand this problem of having intelligence and common sense but not using it for security by analyzing really what people have said about common sense. Voltaire was probably the first to acknowledge that the main problem with common sense is that it isn't all that common. And I think this particular model seems to help. We call this the dog snot model of security, where intelligence and common sense is present but not used. These are my two dogs. That's Wrigley on the left and Carly on the right. These are rescue dogs. We got them from animal shelters. And neither the shelters nor we understood what breed this was. It turns out these are Dutch Shepherds. It's not a breed recognized formally in the United States, but it's very popular in the Netherlands. Dutch farmers bred this breed to haul little carts in the field and to herd sheep. They're very, very intelligent. Carly can understand about 150 words in English. And these dogs are sometimes used for police and military applications because they are very smart. They're not particularly aggressive. And at 50 to 55 pounds, they're easy to pick up and put in a police car or a military vehicle, unlike a big German Shepherd. Well, like a lot of working dogs, if you don't give these guys enough work to do, they'll find a job. And they've decided their main purpose in life is to guard the backyard from Max the barn cat, who occasionally cuts across the backyard. At which point the dogs go berserk. They hurl themselves against the picture window. You can see all the dried dog snot from previous attempts to get at Max the cat. Now, this is really stupid because while these are intelligent dogs, they have an automatic dog door, so they could go around and go outside and bark at Max and maybe potentially even get at him, depending on which route he took. Yet these dogs don't really understand that picture window's present. And you can't claim it's just they don't see it because it's transparent, because with all the dog snot, it really isn't transparent. So this is kind of the model where there's intelligence, common sense there, but it's not being used for security applications. Bruce Schneier coined the term security theater, which means something that's supposed to be for security, but it's really just for show. The classic example would be after September 11th, when the airport screeners were confiscating people's fingernail clippers, presumably under the theory that the would-be terrorist might use the fingernail clipper to threaten the airline pilot with a bad manicure. There's really two ways to spot security theater. One, you can do an effective, thorough vulnerability assessment. Problem is that's expensive, time-consuming, and security managers often don't like the result. Or you can take a look at some of the attributes of the so-called security. And we have a list of about 25 characteristic attributes of security theater. Some are listed here. The ones in red are probably most important. If it's a very urgent, very important security application, there's a high risk that security theater will be implemented. And in particular, if the security or so-called security measure gives a sense of confidence and feel-good kind of aura, that's a bad sign. If it's real security, You're going to understand the vulnerabilities, and you're going to be scared. And the security measure is not going to make you feel very good. When people feel good, that's almost a sure sign you're probably dealing with security theater. If you make the assumption that if security is really, really important, somebody must have thought it through very carefully, you would probably be wrong much of the time. And I'll give you two nuclear examples. This is an example of broken arrows. That's the term for when nuclear warheads are lost. And the United States admits to losing about 60 nuclear warheads in 32 separate security incidents. These weren't stolen. They were typically naval or aircraft incidents. In one case, for example, a nuclear warhead essentially rolled off an aircraft carrier into the ocean. I hate when that happens. But it's not like any big deal. We got all but 11 of them back. So, that's a pretty good percentage. What you see here, the picture in the upper left, is from an incident that occurred in Spain in the 60s, where there was an aircraft carrying 4 gravity nuclear bombs, and it crashed with its refueling tanker in the air, and the 4 bombs fell out, one into the ocean. And you can see the Navy guys very proud that they hauled it out of the ocean after considerable effort, standing there like they had essentially bagged a sailfish or something. And 3 of them landed on land. One of them, the high explosive, went off. It didn't go nuclear, but it launched the nuclear radiation materials. They had to clean up 1,400 tons of contaminated soil and take out a tomato farm in Spain. 2 of them landed, but they just got dented, and you can see the casings from those in the Albuquerque Museum. Now, at one level, this is sort of understandable why there's all these incidents, because there was a military doctrine of having nuclear warheads airborne at all times in case there was a surprise attack during the Cold War. And so when you do that 24/7, there are going to be incidents. What's a little harder to understand is that many of these incidents occurred during training runs when people were flying around with live nuclear warheads just for practice. That might seem to defy common sense. Here's another example. The International Atomic Energy Agency does very important and good work in inspecting nuclear facilities to see if countries are following their international treaty obligations, following the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and using nuclear materials for peaceful purposes only. And they do a good job. Now, the IAEA pressures its member states to be sure they do background checks on their nuclear workers, but the IAEA itself doesn't do any background checks on its employees, including the nuclear inspectors that are allowed inside nuclear facilities. So we don't know if these people going into nuclear facilities are wanted by Interpol or known terrorists, have drug or alcohol problems, have severe financial difficulties, and might be able to be bribed. When the IAEA employees apply for a credit card, they're typically checked out far more carefully than when they are hired to do nuclear applications. And there are a lot of potential risks associated with that in terms of theft and nuclear safety and terrorism and so on. The reason IAEA gives for not doing background checks is that the employees might not like it. It's another interesting incident from the Cold War where common sense would seem to be lacking. This is a thing called the Thing. In 1945, the Soviets gave the U.S. ambassador in Moscow this wooden carving of the Great Seal of the United States of America, and he promptly hung it up in his office. It turned out they discovered 7 years later that it was actually an acoustic resonant cavity. Soviets were beaming microwaves into the resonance and could thereby pick up all the acoustical signals, basically bugging the office. Now, you might wonder the wisdom of sticking a gift from a somewhat adversarial government into a room where there's classified conversations. But then when they accidentally discovered that there was some bugging going on, they tore apart the entire office, and only at the end did anybody go, I wonder if it isn't maybe that wooden thing. This device could have operated for another 50 years easily if it hadn't been discovered. And another classic example that occurs all the time that's really dumb is a failed electronic redaction. In the old days, you used to take black marker and erase the text that you didn't want to be released publicly. And typically people could hold it up to the light and read the letters anyway. But now we have computers, and the whole point of computers is to screw up faster and in a larger scale. And so now we have problems with failed electronic redaction. And this happens time and time and time again, even though lawyers and government agencies and pretty much everybody else has been consistently warned about this problem. This is just a very small sampling of the kinds of incidents that have occurred for the last decade at failed electronic redaction. In 2006, the NSA warned the country about it. When lawyers go to lawyer conferences, they're constantly warned about this. The courts constantly warn lawyers about the dangers of incomplete redaction, and yet it continues to happen. Just this year, CNN inadvertently failed to properly redact the email addresses for Alan Tipper Gore. And you know, when the guy that invented the internet has his private information shared, that we have a serious problem. And just recently in the Rod Blagojevich trial, Blagojevich is the impeached governor of Illinois, who's now being charged with criminal activities. The court ordered the defense team to turn over transcripts of wiretaps, but warned them about being sure to redact information that shouldn't be released publicly. And they promptly screwed that up, including transcripts of wiretaps between Blagojevich and President-elect Obama. This is another kind of common problem we see in physical security, is a problem with security cameras. That background picture is a Crime Stoppers video, which they put on TV and then ask people to tell the police if they recognize those two guys. I'm not even sure those are human beings. I don't know what that is in there. It's clear that if you're going to bother with security cameras, you need to have sufficient resolution to at least recognize your own mom on the camera. Typically, security cameras are implemented for reasons of preventing crime, but that's silly because research shows it doesn't prevent crime. It's somewhat useful for helping to solve crimes. It's often very useful for criminal prosecution. But if you're going to install security cameras and invade everybody's privacy, do it for the right reasons. And we've dabbled a little bit with electronic voting machines. A lot of the work on vulnerabilities associated with voting machines is focused on attacking the microprocessor or the EEPROMs or the data storage or the communications channels. And indeed, those are viable attack vectors, but you've got to be smart to do it. And so we wanted to look at something that anybody can do. And so we attack on the voter's end, where there's typically no security at all. Not that there's much security at the other end, at the smart end, but the voter's end typically has nothing. In this case, we have a Sequoia Advantage AVC voting machine, but I don't want to pick just on Sequoia. I think there's similar problems with other machines. Basically, what you see here is the voters panel. That's typically covered with a piece of paper that has the candidates' names on it. And voters then push the paper close to the candidate they want to vote for, and a light underneath lights up and shines through the translucent paper to show the voter that the candidate he or she picked has been chosen. So what you can do as a voter, although this isn't how you'd really do the attack, is behind the voting curtain, you can pull a paper aside and then just reach inside, remove one of the panels and reach inside the electronics. Now, what kind of mentality would assume it's perfectly okay for the voter to be able to reach inside the innards of the voting machine while it's powered up, with the machine not being aware at all that this is happening? It's kind of mind-boggling. But anyway, all you really have to do is swap 4 wires on the voting panel, and you can switch the votes for 2 candidates. Switching is easier than inventing votes because then the total tally of votes doesn't get screwed up. And then to make it more interesting, we add a radio frequency device that turns the cheating on and off. So if the voting machine is tested before the election and tested afterward, it's going to work normally. But during the voting hours, we're going to cheat. We use this little radio frequency device we build that works at about half a mile away. So we can turn the cheating on and off. Now, it looks pretty easy to actually do a man-in-the-middle on the cable that goes from the voter's end to the microprocessor, where we could actually reprogram the entire election from half a mile away. But that was a lot of work, so we didn't do that. We just focused on switching a couple candidates. And the way this works is when you say vote for candidate G22, the letters run across the columns and the numbers are for the rows. Then a message is sent to the microprocessor. The microprocessor decides if that's a valid candidate. If it is, lights up the light, and the voter's happy. This happens almost instantaneously. So what we can do with our switching of wires is basically light the correct light up when the voter pushes the button. So when he checks G22, that's what lights up, but the message being sent to the microprocessor is H22. Now, there's, as I said, typically no security at the voter's end of most voting machines. In the earlier versions of the Sequoia machine, they had a cheap lock on the voter's end. The new versions don't even have the lock, but I'll show you typically how easy it is to get inside this lock. This is Eric Michaud from our team. You know, if you're going to have a lock, spend a few extra bucks and get one that's at least a little bit a little bit more difficult to defeat. It's true that voting machines aren't actually security devices, but you know, the right to have your votes counted accurately and correctly is a pretty fundamental right. There needs to be some security thought put into this. Another typical problem we see all the time is confusing inventory and security. Inventory is where you count and locate your stuff. It'll catch innocent errors by insiders, but it's not about dealing with spoofing from the bad guys. That's the job of security. And unfortunately, there's often a lot of mission creep. Systems that are really inventory systems very quickly, often within days, come to be viewed as security systems. And that invariably results in lousy security. Here's classic examples: radio frequency identification devices. They send out a unique fixed serial number when they're excited with radio waves. Very useful for inventory, but they're not security devices. It's very easy to lift these things. They just pick them up and stick them on something else without being detected. You can counterfeit them. You can tamper with the reader. You can spoof the reader from a distance. Similar situation with the global positioning system. It's an inventory technology. It was never meant for security, but it's being used that way. Case of RFIDs, we used to demonstrate how we could sniff and clone and spoof readers and attack from a distance, and everybody went, well, national laboratories have all these capabilities. What's that got to do with the real world? So now we just go on the internet and buy these hobbyist kits for cloning, spoofing RFIDs. And these things are very inexpensive and very well done. Sometimes you have to do your own soldering, but other times if you pay a little bit of money, they'll solder it up for you. Problem with GPS is that the private sector, foreigners, and almost the entire U.S. government has to use the civilian signals. Unlike the military signals, they're not encrypted, they're not authenticated. They were never meant for security, but unfortunately they're being used that way. Now you can certainly block or jam GPS signals. You can block the signals from space easily. You can create a noisy RF device that will basically hide the signal from space. You can go on the internet and for $50 buy a GPS jammer. We actually bought one. They're surprisingly well done and work quite nicely. But the more interesting attack is spoofing, because that's surreptitious. It turns out this is easy to do with widely available GPS satellite simulators. You can rent these, you can buy them, you can steal them. They're not export controlled. We were amazed how user-friendly they are. You have to understand almost nothing about GPS or electronics or computers or radio frequency to be able to send fake time and location information to a GPS receiver. And so we demonstrated this in 2002. And since then, we've done a little bit more demonstrations. This is all the equipment you need. It fits in the trunk of a car. And there's the antenna that broadcasts the fake GPS information. And the problem is that GPS receivers are so stupid, they'll glom onto the strongest signal. So you can send a signal 10,000 times stronger than any possible GPS satellite signal from space, and the GPS receivers will happily accept that and ignore the real satellites. Now here, these are stationary GPS receivers. We've done this out to a mile. And even though they're stationary, we're telling them that they're traveling 600 miles per hour. And at a mile, the signal strength is pegged. We quit doing this because we got scared about who we'd be interfering with. But it's clear that you can beam these things enormous distances. And again, not really understand very much about anything going on with GPS. Here we demonstrate that we can change the time on a commercial electronic time synchronization unit. So the time was 3 p.m. and we instantly changed it to 11:55. The lava lamp just shows that we didn't cheat and cut the scene. So what are some of the potential attacks on GPS based on this concept? Well, the scariest one is that a lot of our national utility, financial, telecommunications, and computer networks get their critical time synchronization from GPS signals. And they're in okay shape typically for a day or two of jamming because they have internal clocks. But if they're spoofing, they'll typically crash within milliseconds. And there's other kinds of scary things like the fact that a lot of nuclear materials are transported with the GPS as part of the security measures. Well, there's some good news. We think for about $15 a parts retail, you can tell when you're being spoofed by a GPS satellite simulator. It's hard to deal with a very sophisticated adversary, but at this point, we should at least make it so that the average person in the street can't spoof GPS, and that's what we currently have. Now, there's zero interest in this. We don't yet know of any actual attacks based on GPS spoofing, although it's not clear people would recognize that's what's going on because they're surreptitious attacks. But in the great tradition of Americans and security, we'll wait until there's a huge, nasty incident before we do anything, and then we'll massively overreact, rather than foreseeing this rather obvious vulnerability and fixing the problem. There's also quite a problem, particularly with physical security people, in unwarranted confidence in data encryption and authentication. And these techniques are very useful, but unless you've actually got good security, unless you've dealt with the insider threat, unless you've got cradle-to-grave physical security for the hardware and the software, these things don't really add much security. And in fact, it's unfortunately not true that you can guarantee data authentication, data veracity, if you'll simply authenticate the data. This just doesn't work if the data is wrong. Think switching wires on the voting machine. It doesn't work if you basically are having these devices designed, constructed, operated, and controlled by people you can't trust. It's not a magic silver bullet. It's just a potentially useful tool if you've covered all the other bases. Now, there's a real lack of research-based security practice, particularly in physical security. I think cyber is in better shape there. There are a total of 12 peer-reviewed journals in astrology, but there are no peer-reviewed journals in physical security. At least there weren't until we started one called the Journal of Physical Security. It's a free online journal. There are certainly journals in cryptography and cybersecurity, but in many ways, the field of physical security is not nearly as well advanced, even though it's tens of thousands of years older. This lack of research-based practice is particularly disconcerting, given that there's actually very little research on some very important issues. For example, the two-person rule. With a lot of nuclear materials, there's regulations requiring at least two people be present at all time. Now, we think that's probably a good idea, but we don't know because it's never been researched. It's possible that two people lose individual accountability because you'll count on your partner for covering mistakes if he's there. Again, we don't know. The only research on two-person rule of any significance that's been done was by the Air Force. They would take young males and lock them up in an ICBM missile silo during the Cold War for periods of 4 to 6 weeks. They were alone. They each had a sidearm. And there were two research questions. One, would they launch the nukes when the president said to? And number two, would they end up annoying each other to the point where they'd shoot each other? But it's not clear that research is terribly relevant for everyday kinds of two-person rules. Everybody agrees that security culture is a very important aspect of security. Almost nobody studies it. We believe security climate's more important. Culture are the formal rules, regulations, policies. Climate are the informal perceptions about security. Does your boss really do what he or she says you should do with security? There's very little looking at countermeasures for the insider threat. I'll talk about that a little bit. And in particular, there's no studies of countermeasures for perceptual blindness. And perceptual blindness is a very big problem. I'll prove to you that you're not very good at perception. This is a classic optical illusion. And hopefully everybody will see the white triangle there in the center. See this guy here. But of course, that triangle doesn't exist. I'll prove that to you by taking away the components. So I've shown you there is no white triangle, but you're still seeing it. Now, I can kind of understand glancing at an image and misinterpreting what you're seeing, but now I've shown you there is no white triangle, and you're still seeing it. I mean, you people are clearly highly delusional. I understand why they let you come to the Usenix conference. You're probably creeping people out back in the office and any excuse to get you out of there. But in fact, the problem is we're all delusional. We all have these perceptual and cognitive shortcuts, which were very useful when we had to worry about being attacked by saber-toothed tigers to allow us to make decisions very quickly. But they produce a lot of errors. Here's another classic example. Cognitive psychologists have done versions of this for decades. There's a video which you show subjects, and there are two teams, one in yellow, one in blue, that are passing basketballs. and the subjects are told to count the number of passes of the basketball the one team does. So they watch the video, and then at the end, the cognitive psychologists say, who saw something unusual in the video? And typically about half the people don't know what they're talking about. It turns out in the video that there's a person in a gorilla suit that walks into the middle of the scene, the gorilla pounds his chest, and then walks out. And fully half of the people didn't see that. And then when you re-show the video, they do see the gorilla, but then many of them insist you swapped videos because there's no way they could miss a gorilla. Now here's the scary part. When cognitive psychologists do eye tracking and see what the people are looking at, the majority of the people who did not see the gorilla looked at the gorilla. They just didn't perceive the gorilla. It turns out that the human brain only sees what you're mentally prepared to see. And cognitive psychologists have spent 50 years demonstrating this. There's some very serious security implications for security guards and nuclear inspectors. This is largely an unresearched area. Cognitive psychologists love to point out how stupid people are, but there's not a lot of research on countermeasures, and there's no research really on countermeasures for security applications. Here's another problem where common sense often isn't applied. The insider threat's a very difficult problem to deal with. Most organizations just ignore it. A lot of the motivation for insider threat you can't do anything about. For example, greed. How are you going to make people less greedy? But one of the key elements motivating insider attacks is disgruntlement. There are things you can do about disgruntlement. In general, it's kind of a dumb policy to have phony or non-existent grievance and complaint resolution processes, because these can be very effective at reducing disgruntlement. And oftentimes security managers will brag about how little their grievance process is used, as if that was a good thing. It's not. It's a mistake to have phony or non-existent anonymous whistleblower programs, and you definitely should have anonymous tip hotlines. Big mistake not to have constraints on bully bosses and not to constrain the tyranny of the Human Resources Department. In principle, the Human Resources Department is one of the most powerful tools for mitigating disgruntlement, but in most organizations it works the opposite way. They're basically a judge, jury, executioner, and secret police, and they increase disgruntlement rather than mitigating it. Disgruntlement's all about unmet expectations. Employees who are treated badly but expect to be aren't necessarily disgruntled. You certainly need to be watching for the sudden changes in employee behavior that are often precursors to an insider attack. Not everybody who undergoes these types of changes is going to do an insider attack, but the majority of people who do insider attacks will show some of these precursor behaviors. What's important is a sudden change. Some people are this way all the time, and that isn't necessarily an insider threat problem. I'm from Chicago. I'm a big believer in bribery. You should definitely try to bribe your employees, your contractors, your vendors. Not only can you check on the loyalty of a given individual, but word will quickly get around that it would be a smart idea to turn down bribes. And if someone doesn't accept the bribe, let them keep the money and publicize what a great employee, contractor, or vendor they are. It's certainly a mistake to think that your only insider threat comes from your employees. You've got vendors, contractors, lawyers, public relations people, visitors, temps. You really have to take a bigger picture view of what the insider threat is. Mistake to think that only high-level employees are the risk. Typically, low-level employees are invisible in an organization. They can wander around. Nobody really asks what they're up to. Kind of dumb to use polygraphs. In 2002, the National Research Council undertook a study that demonstrated that polygraphs, in effect, they didn't use these terms, is pseudoscientific nonsense, not appropriate for routine employee screening. Of course, the inventor of the polygraph is William Marsden in 1920, and he's famous also for another invention, which is the comic book superhero Wonder Woman. She had a lasso that she'd wrap around you, and then you had to tell the truth. And there's about as much reality in that as there is in polygraphs. It's been pointed out that in most states, if you want to be certified as a barber, you need far more formal training than if you want to be a polygraph examiner. And a lot of organizations try to cover up the fact when an employee steals, they just quietly fire them. Big mistake. You've got to go public and make it clear the organization will not stand for any unethical and illegal behavior. I want to talk now a little bit about seals, tamper-indicating seals, because this is an area of a constant dumbness that we see. Some terminology: a lock, of course, is meant to delay access. It doesn't stop it. Even amateurs can defeat locks if sufficiently motivated. A seal, on the other hand, is meant to leave behind evidence that there's been unauthorized access. You can think about tamper-evident packaging like found on food and pharmaceuticals. That's probably the most familiar example of a tamper-indicating seal. Lots of different seals out there used for lots of important things. We talk about defeating a seal. This means you remove the seal and then you reseal the container using either the original seal or a counterfeit, but you have to do this without being detected. That's the key point. So it's important to realize that a seal is not a lock. If I yank it off at the time of inspection, it's going to be clear that the seal is missing or damaged or otherwise altered. And so here's some seals facts that are often overlooked. All seals have to have a unique identifier like a serial number. Otherwise, you can just take the seal off and put on another one, and no one will know the difference. A few years ago, I was called up by the chief security officer of a major corporation that sells massive quantities of consumer electronics. And he said, we're sealing up our trucks, but when they reach the destination, the seal is intact, but stuff is missing from the truck, and we can't figure out what's going on. So I said, okay, why don't you tell me about the seal and about how you use the seal? And he said, well, we use these white cable ties. And I said, so these are the same white cable ties that anybody can buy at the hardware store for 4 cents a piece? And he said, yes. And I said, there's no unique serial number on it, so you couldn't tell if one had been cut off and a duplicate put back on. He said, yes. I said, these are the same cable seals where if you take a fingernail file, you can pick it open in 2 seconds. He said, gee, we didn't know that. So he says, what do you think the problem is? We're often asked for seals you don't have to inspect, and I'm not sure what that is. I don't know if they have in mind a lock or some kind of real-time monitor burglar alarm. And the interesting thing about seals is, in the end, it's about fooling people. It's not really about beating hardware, unlike beating locks or safes. Now, IT people like to use adhesive label seals, little sticky label things they put on computer ports and hard disks and jewel cases for CDs and envelopes with users' passwords. And unless your adversary is 8 years old, this is security theater. This isn't really accomplishing anything. Well, we've looked at lots of seals, maybe about 850 total. And I'm going to concentrate on the 244 we studied most carefully, but the results are about the same for the others. So these 244 seals run the gamut from government, commercial, mechanical, electronic, low-tech through high-tech. 4 orders of magnitude difference in cost. And these things are used for important applications. And they can all be defeated quickly using only low-tech tools, methods, and supplies available to anybody. So, for example, here's a plot of the percentage of seals that can be defeated in less than a given amount of time. Half the seals can be defeated in under a minute. Most of the seals in under 10, all the seals in under 45 minutes. That's with one person well practiced in the attack, working alone. Sometimes an assistant would actually speed up the attack from what's shown here. So this isn't a good situation. This summarizes the results. The mean time to the completion of the attack is 1.4 minutes with a median or midpoint of 43 seconds. We have the resources of a national laboratory available to us. We don't need it. The average cost is $78 for attacking one kind of seal. Median's $5. And maybe more disconcerting, we're not spending months scratching our heads thinking about how to attack these seals. The average time to finding a viable attack is 2.3 hours with a median of 12 minutes. It may take longer to get good at the attack, though. And these plots show that the high-tech ones aren't substantially better. This top graph is a log-log plot of the attack time versus the cost of the seal. This bottom one is a plot of the attack time versus a subjective ranking of the degree of high technology used by the seal. And in either case, the correlation coefficients are very, very weak. And the slope's almost horizontal. So on average, if you spend an extra $1 per seal, you only add 0.27 seconds to the defeat time. And if you bump up one level of technology, whatever that means exactly, you only add 0.17 seconds. So the good news is that most of these attacks are simple countermeasures, but the people using the seals have to understand the seal, the most likely attack scenarios. They have to have seen examples of attack seals. They have to have a lot of hands-on training. This is more work than most people want to do, even for nuclear safeguards. We also think, though, that better seals are possible. What's the problem? Well, with a conventional seal, you can detect the opening of the seal, but you have to store that information in or on the seal until such time as the seal can be inspected. And that's where the bad guys attack. They hide or erase the information, the alarm condition, or they put on a fresh counterfeit seal that doesn't have the alarm condition. So we think a better approach is what we call the anti-evidence method. When you first install a seal, you store information in or on the seal that tampering has not yet occurred. Then when that happens, it gets erased. And now the bad guys have nothing to erase, hide, or counterfeit if they don't know that secret byte or two that is the anti-evidence. So it's really the absence of the evidence that's the evidence of the tampering. And we've developed several dozen different types of prototypes for these types of seals. They have another number of very interesting attributes that we think are very useful. But in particular, they have an anti-gun decking feature. Now, gun decking is a Navy term. Back in the 18th century, if you were a British Navy sailor and you wanted to goof off, you would go hide out on the gun deck because unless a battle was underway, it was pretty quiet there. One of the problems with tamper-indicating seals is the seal inspector said that she checked the seal, but did she really? Well, it turns out with anti-evidence seals, if you simply don't tell the inspector the anti-evidence information, but instead make them report it back to headquarters, which they can do through non-secure communications channels, then the act of obtaining the anti-evidence is essentially the same as checking the seal to see if there's been tampering. Now, here's an example of a prototype anti-evidence seal. We developed this for a fictitious trucking company called Near Miss Trucking. We were going to do it for Acme Trucking, but it turns out there really isn't Acme Trucking. That's a simple idea. There are 250 slogans well known to the employees of Near Miss Trucking. Those slogans are not secret. What is secret is exactly which slogan was chosen for a given shipment. And here's some examples of the slogans. Anyway, the way this works is the seal reader sends a password that says, I'm the good guy. It's okay to tell me the slogan. This is done through short-range radio frequency. And then the seal speaks a slogan. If you hear the right slogan, the truck hasn't been opened prematurely. If you hear the wrong slogan or a different slogan, then you know that the truck's been opened. We often will play the wrong slogan if there's been tampering because we don't want to tip off the bad guys that we know they got in. We like very much this audio approach because with seals that are read with an automated reader, so often we see situations where the seal's been smashed open, but the reader's happy, and when the reader's happy, the inspector's happy. So with the audio approach, that leaves the eyes at least free to look at the overall scene, check the hasp and locking mechanisms, carefully look at the seal, look at the container, and so on. And we've also looked at the security of urine drug tests. A lot of seals are used in that application. And we've demonstrated that it's very easy. Amateurs can tamper with the urine test kits that are most widely used by the U.S. government, by international sporting bodies, and so on. And even more disturbing, the security protocols for testing athletes, employees, transportation people after an accident. Those security protocols are really dreadfully bad. One would think, given the importance of this kind of thing, first of all, to the individual, in terms of livelihood, career, reputation, and also to society, to law enforcement, and to employers, that this would be something where we'd have really, really good security. But in fact, it's pretty much of a joke. Lots of dumb security blunders associated with cargo security. This is kind of the classic one. We've been doing this thing for about 100 years now, where everybody loves to seal or lock the handle on a transportainer door or a truck door or sometimes a rail car door. And the fact is that nobody really cares about the handle. The only thing that's really important is the vertical locking bar. Because what cargo thieves do is they'll pop off this rivet here, connecting the vertical locking rod to the handle. Often because of the salt air, that rivet's basically corroded and ready to come off anyway. And then the cargo thieves can simply rotate the vertical locking bar without bothering the handle or the locker seal that's attached, and then open the container. And then they'll put something back that kind of looks like a rivet, or re-rivet. Now, to try to deal with this problem, some manufacturers have made something called the locking bar, which keeps the two vertical locking rods on a transportainer from rotating. There's some problems with this product, but it's not a bad concept. However, it's not a very successful product. What they had to do is basically run a cable over here and put a locker seal on the handle because the users refused to look 1 foot over. They're so used to checking the handle for security that they couldn't deal with it. Sort of an example of really a lack of common sense. Talk a little bit about access control devices. In our experience, it's really easy to tamper with commercial or government access control devices, including biometrics. Lots of different possible attack vectors. Typically, these devices, even though they're security devices, have little or no security built in, and clearly little or no security thought applied to them. Very important on any security device to have cradle-to-grave secure chain of custody right from the factory. If we can get 15 to 30 seconds of access to any security device at the factory while it's sitting on the loading dock, before it's installed, after it's installed, we can typically completely own that device for all time. Here's kind of an example of the approach used for security products. This is actually, for the money, a pretty good security device. It's a motion sensor. It's a dual type, which has got a Doppler microwave motion sensor and a passive infrared. And they've decided they're going to apply some security to the box, and so they apply an adhesive label seal. And the problem is when you turn it over, you can just open the bottom of the box. Now, it's not that this adhesive label seal is providing such fabulous security, but if you're going to bother, why not just follow through, spend an extra 3 cents, and put one on the bottom, too? I mean, it's kind of typical of the kind of lazy approach to security that we see with people working in the security field. I understand a product that isn't about security not having good security, but if you're selling security, you ought to actually have security. It's often wrong to assume that manufacturers have this incredibly difficult manufacturing process that nobody can duplicate. In our experience, it's usually not true. Plus, typically their patents, which by law must be fully disclosing, will tell you everything you need as a bad guy. But what's often overlooked is you don't really have to counterfeit a security device. You just need to sort of mimic it. That's usually good enough, and that's a lot easier than doing true counterfeiting. So the question is, if you've got an access control device or biometrics device, is that really your device? Or is it a counterfeit version or one that's been tampered with? Or has a box been slid over the outside of it and you basically have a man-in-the-middle attack? So what you can do, a very simple countermeasure, which essentially nobody does, is to check at random unpredictable times with random unpredictable people to see if unauthorized people actually get rejected. This kind of approach is very rare. I mean, if you think about it, when's the last time you checked whether the combination on your safe, if you dialed 3 wrong numbers, whether the safe would open? Typically, everybody's happy when you dial 3 numbers and the safe opens and you assume you had the right combination. But this is the equivalent of actually checking whether you will be rejected if you're genuinely unauthorized. But it has to all be unpredictable, otherwise there's no point to it. In terms of access control, we see lots of dumb door turnstile designs. People will spend a lot of money on a fancy biometric or access control device, and then anybody can go over and take a credit card and pop open the door. Particularly stupid that these devices typically don't know when the door has been opened. That's what they're supposed to be doing, is monitoring access to the door, and many of them, if you can open the door in another way, simply don't know about it. You should track who exits if you're bothering to track who enters. And it's true that any high school kid can go on eBay and get a machine, use secondhand one that'll print security badges, but at least make them do that. It's amazing how many organizations have very bad security at the place where they prepare the security badges for their employees. Biometrics have all the same kind of blunders as access control, except that people typically don't understand how easy it is to counterfeit a biometric, despite what the vendors say. But why would you bother? There's typically no serious security in the devices themselves, so it's easier to spoof the devices. Big mistake to download the entire biometric database to a satellite station when 98% of your employees aren't going to use that satellite station, but this happens all the time. So you've got these satellite stations way out in the boonies in the facility with essentially guards not paying any attention to it, and it's got the organization's entire biometric database. No common sense there. The default is typically to have the satellite stations have an enroll function. Stupid. I'm not saying don't do security in depth, don't do multiple layers. That's okay. It may be the best security strategy. But here's the problem. When we first approach a security program and we ask what their security strategy is, if they say it's layered security, we immediately know they're in big trouble. If their security strategy is something else, and then, by the way, we use layered security, then we know they're probably going to be okay. Layered security is so often misapplied. It tends to increase complexity, which is never good for security. It's simply not true that multiple layers of bad security somehow magically add up to good security. It's often mindlessly applied. People don't understand how the layers interact, how they can interfere with each other. Oftentimes, the layers don't even back each other up. It leads to complacency. Yes, I don't recognize those guys that are stealing the nuclear warhead and taking it through that hole in the fence that I've never seen before. But hey, we got layered security, so I'm sure it's going to be okay. It tends to be a cop-out. People will, in many cases, fail to try to improve any given layer because they have layered security. I don't mean to be mean to engineers. I think they're fabulous. They do wonderful things, and we absolutely need them. But in general, they have completely the wrong mindset about security. And if the only people looking at security are engineers, you're in big trouble. Engineers tend to view nature as the adversary. They're really focused on stochastic errors. They don't really have this mindset about thinking about deliberate, malicious intent. They're typically not predisposed to thinking like the bad guys. They're more typically focused on the customer. And that's probably a good thing, but not necessarily for security. They tend to focus on user friendliness, not necessarily making things difficult for the bad guys. They love to add extra features, which typically provide extra attack vectors. And they want their products to be simple to maintain, repair, and diagnose, which usually means it's simple to attack. And we encounter this blunder all the time, what we call the Band-Aid or kitchen sink approach, where, first of all, we're going to develop a product, but we're only going to worry about security at the end. That just never works. Security is difficult enough when you design it in from scratch at the very beginning. If you try to add it on as an ad hoc, it just doesn't work. And then it's very common to try to slap on a number of technologies, including the latest fad technology, and hope somehow the whole mess adds up to good security. But again, it doesn't really work that way. Here's some typical security design blunders that we see. People love to leave the diagnostics and the back doors in when they go ahead and field the device, like JTAG. That's a mistake. This I've never understood. It's amazing how many times on any product, any microprocessor-based product, much less security products, they fail to set the microprocessor security bit. I mean, it takes 10 seconds. Yes, it's not an absolute silver bullet. The bad guys can still reverse engineer your microprocessor code if you do set the security bit, but they have to do a lot more work. Why in the world would you not set the microprocessor security bit? It's completely crazy. It's very common on security devices to have the biometrics data, the passwords, the PIN, sitting out there on EEPROM bare. No attempt made to mask it. Now, masking isn't going to provide absolute protection, but at least you make the bad guys do a little bit of work. Never worry about high-tech attacks because low-tech attacks work just fine on high-tech systems. Surprising how many security devices don't have any ability to detect tampering, either while powered up or while just sitting around. And it's clear to us that a mechanical tamper switch is really essentially the same as no tamper detection at all. There's a mechanical tamper switch on my refrigerator. When you open the door, the light comes on, apparently in hopes of scaring away the intruder, but it doesn't work on me. Don't use sockets for key electronic components like microprocessors. At least make the bad guys desolder something or pull off a printed circuit board. And again, if you're going to have a lock or seal, spend a couple extra bucks and get something reasonably good. We constantly encounter a lot of mistaken myths about vulnerabilities and vulnerability assessments. First of all, the assumption that there's a small number of vulnerabilities is always wrong. There's always a very, very large number. You're never even going to know about most of your vulnerabilities. Hopefully that's true of the bad guys too. The reason we think this is whenever we do a vulnerability assessment for a second or third or fourth time on the same device, system, or program, we always find brand new vulnerabilities. Sometimes obvious ones we missed the first time. And we find vulnerabilities that other people missed and vice versa. It's just unending. And it's a mistake to think you can find or even eliminate all those vulnerabilities. You can't. It's common to think of vulnerabilities as bad news, but in fact that's quite wrong. They're great news. Because vulnerabilities always exist, if you can find one, then you have a chance to do something about it. But it's very difficult to get people to have this mindset where, gee, it's good news, we found another hole in the fence, isn't that great? But that is indeed the correct way to think about security. Finding a vulnerability is excellent news. You need to act on it, however. And if you do a vulnerability assessment and they don't find any vulnerabilities, or they find very few, then have it redone by people who are competent. Very, very common not to understand what a vulnerability assessment's for. It's solely for the purpose of improving security. It's not some kind of test you pass. I don't even know what that means. It's not something you do to justify all the money you've already spent on development. It's not something to certify the device or the program, not something to praise or blame people. It's simply to improve security. Now, if you want to use the results of a vulnerability assessment to decide on whether it makes sense to field a particular security device, system, or measure, that might make sense. But the vulnerability assessment itself alone cannot help you decide that information. It's essential to do vulnerability assessments early in the development process, not at the end when it's too late to change anything. You need to do them iteratively. You need to do them periodically. Watch out for sham rigor. A lot of people doing what they claim are vulnerability assessments claim to have this rigorous process. It's all nonsense. What you're trying to do is predict what the bad guys might do. We don't understand security. We don't understand human psychology. We don't understand risk management or threat assessment well enough to be rigorous about any of this stuff. And watch out for the fallacy of precision. A lot of vulnerability assessors have these big matrices of probabilities and risk factors and weights. And while it may be okay to help decide how you want to field resources, it's typically not that useful for finding vulnerabilities. And in any event, just because you can assign a number to something, it doesn't mean you really understand it. And don't rely just on software tools, even in cybersecurity, to look for vulnerabilities. That's a great place to start, but it's not enough. You have to think creatively. The bad guys are probably not using software tools to find your vulnerabilities. They're probably thinking creatively about how to get you. There are lots of tools out there that purport to find vulnerabilities, and they typically don't. They're really better for deciding how you want to field your security resources. Don't let attack methods define the vulnerabilities. It really has to be the other way around. And in many cases, people really focus on the threats. That's who might attack, when, and how. And if you get the threats wrong, which is easy to do, and you don't understand your vulnerabilities, you don't have anything. Whereas if you really understand your vulnerabilities and you get the threats wrong, you're probably going to be okay. So I'm not saying don't do both. You should do threat assessment. You should do vulnerability assessments. But in my view, you get more bang for the buck from the vulnerability assessments. Now, I get paid for that, so of course I think that. But I still think that's the true position. And it's amazing how often the people who do the vulnerability assessments are the guys who can't figure out a new place to have lunch. I mean, the company man, the person who's never colored outside the lines is often doing the vulnerability assessments. It doesn't work that way. If you don't have creative type hacker mentality doing your vulnerability assessments, go find people in your organization that already think that way. The people who are questioning authority and always finding loopholes and basically being a pain in the butt. Those people instinctively understand security vulnerabilities, so you might as well put them to good use. They don't have to be security experts necessarily. A lot of security vulnerabilities exist at the interfaces between modules or technologies, so don't just have the software people look at software and the mechanical engineers look at mechanical things. You need the experts, but they have to look holistically at vulnerabilities. And you certainly have to think like the bad guys. It's amazing how often good guys who desperately want their security to work, who spent their lives and their careers being good guys, have trouble seeing how the security might fail. So bring in people who can think like the bad guys. And never let the good guys define the problem. Just because we have a security fence doesn't mean the bad guys have to go over it, under it, through it. Just because we installed a biometric access control device on the outside of the R&D laboratory doesn't mean the bad guys will attack it. They may come in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They may bribe somebody. They may steal the entire laboratory, leaving the door and the access control device behind. Compliance-based security, we all have to follow the rules and regulations and make auditors happy. Unfortunately, that usually has nothing to do with security. My experience, about 20% of official security rules actually make security worse. I'm not talking about devoting resources and energy and time to something that's totally pointless. I'm talking about having rules that really are bad for security. You have to do the compliance, but you also have to do the security. It's a real danger sign when you have overly complex, rapidly changing, variably interpreted, stupid security rules. That tends to create a cynical attitude among employees about security, and it results in typically very, very bad security. And then there are the rules that only the good guys follow. When I go into my bank, they make me take off my hat and sunglasses. Of course, if I'm there to rob the bank, I'm not going to do that. So typically when you have rules that only the good guys are going to follow, it's essentially security theater. Most organizations put way too much emphasis on protecting physical assets instead of far more important things like people and buildings and organizational reputation and intellectual property and personally identifiable information. Physical security people in particular are really hung up on physical things, which is maybe understandable. I think cyber people have a broader view of what security is all about. And it's amazing how often, even inside nuclear facilities, we find situations where people are locking or sealing doors where the hinges are on the outside, so the bad guy can pop the hinges and open the door without bothering the lock or the seal. I mean, that would seem to be a fairly common sense kind of thing, but we consistently see that problem. Just my personal view, but I think our responses to terrorism have been remarkably stupid. There's very little interest, for example, in having better seals or better seal use protocols. The Department of Homeland Security is interested only in commercially available seals that can be purchased now, which is very unfortunate because what's out there isn't very good and how it's used isn't very good. At the airport, they do behavioral screening. This is complete nonsense. It's not based on any research results. It potentially could be if anybody would study this seriously. This is purely amateur hour. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They're basically just scaring little old ladies who are afraid to fly. It's beyond security theater. This is just dumb. Of course, the no-fly list, inexcusably stupid. This is clearly unconstitutional. It's punishment without criminality. It's lack of due process. The redress process is completely inappropriate and ineffective. Warrantless wiretaps. When we have to basically compromise fundamental American values and principles and the Constitution, then the terrorists have won, even if nobody dies. There's simply no excuse for doing warrantless wiretaps. The Founding Fathers set up a separation of powers, and specifically in their wisdom saw that there should be oversight of search and seizure of private citizens. The argument that it's too risky and there's delays in getting a warrant is just complete nonsense. Of course, the color-coded threat level, I mean, that was a joke a long time ago. And this one particularly annoys me. The U.S. is very good at pop culture. Our music videos, our songs, our movies, a lot of what we do on the internet is all over the world, including in developing countries. Why in the world aren't we leveraging this expertise in pop culture to make it very uncool to be a terrorist? Yet we're not doing that. Stupid. The one thing we're actually are good at, and we're not using this to fight terrorism. Now, the 9/11 terrorist incident was horrific, terrible tragedy for our country, terrible tragedy for the families who lost loved ones. But let's put it in perspective. In 2001, here are some deaths that occurred in addition to terrorism from 9/11. And the ones below the 9/11 terrorism are all largely preventable. So why did America change? Yes, we have to improve our security. Yes, we have to deal with terrorism. Yes, we have to chase down the scumbags who did this. But let's put it in perspective. This is not a nationally challenged problem. This is something we certainly need to deal with, and a terrible tragedy for the victims. This lists the odds of a typical American dying from certain causes, and you can see the terrorism is way down there at the bottom. If you want to be scared of something, be scared about getting in an automobile. It's an incredibly dangerous activity, just remarkably dangerous. It's also true that, according to FBI statistics, only 6% of terrorist incidents on U.S. soil are due to radical Islamists. So, we need to have the right perspective. We need to do a good job on risk assessment. In any area of security, prevention's hard, maybe not fully possible. We need to focus more on mitigation, on recovery, and resiliency. That's how we win the fight on terrorism. We don't win it with prevention, although we should do the best we can with prevention. So the question comes up, why in the world is there so much dumbness associated with security? And here's my theory. First of all, if it's really important security, or if it's a large organization, you've got lots of committees and bureaucrats and other knuckleheads involved in the whole issue. And typically committees and bureaucrats are not just dumber than the sum of the parts, they're dumber than the dumbest member. So, of course, they're not going to necessarily do a good job with security. And then we have this problem. Our leaders, business executives, even people who work in security, sometimes maintain this myth that security is a little bit like taking out the garbage. If you will just devote your energy to doing it, if you just get around to do it, it'll all get taken care of. And in fact, that's quite wrong. Security is very, very difficult, may not be fully possible. We need to move out of that mode that it's an easy thing to do. It's not. Typically, people in organizations aren't used to thinking critically about security. They'll think critically about everything else, but not about security. And then there's this myth that if it's important, somebody must have thought it through, that the same security procedures we've been doing for a decade, the guys back then must have known what the heck they were doing or they wouldn't have set it up this way. That's usually quite wrong. They were probably winging it. They had no idea typically what they were doing anyway. Security theater is a real threat. Security theater is always easier than real security. Now, it may not be easier for the people affected by it, but it's always easier for the people providing the security. And laziness, thinking is hard work. People and organizations will many times do anything they can to avoid thinking. And there's a real problem, particularly with physical security. It's not a real field. There's only one research journal that's peer-reviewed, which we started. When you go to a security conference in physical security, there's typically no R&D results. You're listening to some guy whose main qualifications are he's managed to stay employed in the field for 30 years. And the physical security managers attending the conference are writing down everything he says. And there's no critical thinking, there's no questioning, there's no research results. It's a mess. Not like you guys. Cybersecurity is in much better shape in that regard. So what can physical security learn from you people? I think we could learn that vulnerabilities are numerous. They're constantly evolving. Get used to it. Physical security people are very uncomfortable with the idea of vulnerabilities, and you really can't be. And in particular, in physical security, we need to learn that when there are vulnerabilities, when there are security incidents, it doesn't mean somebody's been screwing up necessarily. Scapegoating is a big deal in physical security. I think cyber is a little better about that. And because a lot of the IT support people are the cybersecurity people in many organizations, I think you have a better sense of the importance of productivity, that security has to factor in its impact on productivity, and you have much better customer focus in general. That's largely lacking from physical security. I think cyber people understand that technology is not a panacea. It's a great tool, but in the end, it's all about people. That's what security is all about. And you've got to make the end users do the right things. It doesn't really matter how good your security is. What could cyber people learn from physical security? Well, I think physical security managers are very good at making the business case for security. They're very good at project management, at budgeting. They can meet deadlines, not necessarily a cyber strength. And in physical security, despite the fact that it's a very macho field, if it even is a field, people in physical security recognize that women can be very effective security professionals. If you go to a physical security conference, 40% of the audience may be female. You guys don't do that well here in cyber. So you need to improve there. And I think there's a certain realization among physical security people that good cybersecurity requires good physical security. Cyber people will pay that lip service, but I'm not sure they fully get that. So bottom line, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. At the very least, try to avoid the dog snot kinds of security mistakes. We need to constantly be thinking critically, carefully, and creatively about security and not fall a victim to some really lack of common sense. Now, if you'd like some additional information on some of these topics, I have a few CDs here with me, but if you'll send me an email or leave me your business card, I'll be glad to send a variety of different materials involving reports, presentations, and papers about various aspects of the things I've talked about. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Hi, Dave Wagner. Wonderful talk. I'm curious, you mentioned adhesive seals are security theater and are easily defeated. Any tips how to defeat them?
Well, adhesive label seals are often used for short durations. I'm going out to lunch, so I'm going to put this little seal on. The problem is the adhesives typically don't set up for the first 48 hours. So if you apply a little bit of heat, that'll help. But if it's important security, don't use adhesive label seals. Now, if you insist you got to use them, we do have a series of recommendations for how to use them more effectively. You're not going to like it because it's a lot of work. The beauty of adhesive label seals is any idiot can slap one on and feel good about it. But if you're going to really use them for serious tamper detection, then you're going to have to do a lot of work. But certainly contact me. We can offer those suggestions. There just doesn't seem to be a way to do good security with a pressure-sensitive adhesive label. You really need to rethink that. And many times people are so focused on putting a seal or a lock on the existing thing or the container. Think about getting a container that you put the thing in and lock or seal that, because then you can really design the security for that outside container instead of trying to force fit something on something that it's really very difficult to try to secure.
Thank you.
You mentioned that roughly 1 in 80 people dies in a car accident. So, and from that, you then concluded that it's very dangerous to actually enter a car. The conclusion is actually incorrect. So what happens is, it turns out that entering an airplane is more dangerous than entering a car. And the reason why we actually come at these statistics is that we basically are in cars many more times than we are in airplanes. Thank you for the correction.
Well, that's a very good point, yes. But you still face a far higher probability of being killed in a car crash than you do being killed in an airplane crash. But your point is very true. And if you look at there's other issues. More people are injured falling, getting on or off the airplane than are injured getting in or out of automobiles. So yeah, it's a complex issue. But thank you for your comments.
So, August Reese, I'm curious. In subsequent, was this one off? Yeah. On top. Slide it towards you. Okay. So I'm curious, in subsequent vulnerability assessments that you've done in a given organization, have you noticed the same vulnerabilities creeping up? Do they get it? Do they actually fix the things that you find, or do they keep coming up again and again?
Well, there's a maxim that we call the coulda, woulda, shoulda maxim that says if security managers are aware that there's a simple countermeasure that could be implemented to fix the vulnerability, they will stop worrying about the vulnerability even if they didn't implement the countermeasure. So we often see that scenario where they go, well, you guys did a great job. Thanks for finding this vulnerability. We now feel a lot better, but then they don't bother to do anything with it. So that's one problem. There's a certain amount of denial. A lot of people essentially engage us to do a vulnerability assessment under the assumption that we will come back to them and say, not only are there no vulnerabilities, but you guys are security geniuses. And that doesn't usually happen. And so there's a kind of a tendency to not want to hear it. And one of the interesting things about this job I've been doing for a couple decades now, it's easy to find the vulnerabilities. The hard part is to get somebody to acknowledge they exist, even when you demonstrate them right in front of them, and to do something about it. The trick is the psychology of how you basically get people to deal with these vulnerabilities. And I learned you've got to start out by pointing out the good things they do. Because number one, it may be an accident, and you don't want them to stop doing the good things. But number two, you've got to psychologically set them up so they don't feel so awful about themselves. They simply don't have the energy to implement the changes. But it's a mixed bag. Some organizations and some people take our stuff to heart. We always make it clear we're going to provide way more suggestions than you could possibly implement. In the end, it's not up to the vulnerability assessors to decide. It's up to the people doing the real security. And so it's okay not to worry about all the vulnerabilities we pointed out, and that seems to help. If you give them this sense of course there are vulnerabilities you can't mitigate, that's okay. You at least understand them. Maybe in the future something will come up and you'll be able to deal with them. So, it's kind of a mixed bag, but generally vulnerability assessment's a really dismal field. There's just not a lot of victories and a lot of warm and fuzzies, and nobody loves the vulnerability assessor. They're always the SOBs that are causing problems.
Well, Rick Farrow, thanks. You pretty much answered my question, which is how do you get people to pay attention to vulnerability assessments and psychology and telling them the good parts. But I did come up with a second question standing here. That was a very nice answer. I liked it. how do you deal with coming back and you're doing a second vulnerability assessment and you find pretty much the same things? I mean, the psychology didn't work the first time. Do you just get depressed? Do you try something else?
Well, I guess I view our job as kind of like lawyers. Lawyers shouldn't be running things. They should just be offering advice. And I think, in the end, we're not the people responsible for the security. And if we point out a vulnerability and the organization hasn't dealt with it, in the end, they're the ones responsible, and they're the ones who need to make the decision. And in some cases, they may have decided that we've just exaggerated the vulnerability, or they just don't have the resources to deal with it. And I can't take that personally. I mean, like I said, all we can offer is advice. It frustrates me when there are vulnerabilities that are easy to fix. I understand complex ones that are expensive and a real pain to try to implement any countermeasure. But the ones where if you spend an extra second looking for this one thing on the seal, for example, I don't understand why those aren't implemented. But again, you just have to go, okay, we provided our advice, you don't want to pay attention. In the end, you're going to be held accountable for your security. It's really not my problem. But I'm not sure I really, we can point out again and try to reemphasize. In many cases, if we'll work on that attack some more and show them that it's even easier than we originally thought, because it often is. If we spend more time, we'll find a really, really easy way to do it. And the hope is then that'll encourage them to actually fix it.
Thanks.
Great talk. Really enjoyed it. I had a question that may have been buried in that last series of slides where you're saying where do we go, and it's more of an economic question of, organizations that you deal with on a regular basis have a fixed budget. Where is the low-hanging fruit? Where do you put your money first?
I really think it's in the common sense. You don't necessarily have to go out and hire really good vulnerability assessors like us. Go find the people in your organization that think that way and let them wander around and think about how they'd attack. It doesn't cost anything. They're usually more knowledgeable than even outside vulnerability assessors about at least the local issues. Typically, they'll have fun doing it. And in many cases, these people are, if you're not careful, their hacker types are going to cause you problems anyway. Turn them to the good side of the force by having them help you think about the real security issues. So I'd say every organization should find those people. I mean, they're the artists, the graphic artist types. They're the public relations people. They're the hands-on, the guy who goes and works on his car in his garage. They're the smart aleck that everybody hates because he knows everything. These are the kinds of hacker mentality people that you're looking for. Usually you can employ them for not very much money or maybe none at all. And that's where I'd start. And then, try to bring in people fresh who don't do security on a day-to-day basis because they at least have some common sense that hasn't been totally written out of them, and they might have a possibility of spotting something. So that's, I think, a relatively low-cost thing that every organization should do. Very few do it. Typically, if you're in a large organization and you have a comment about security, you're going to get in trouble. You're not going to be praised for providing interesting input that may be useful.
Great. Thank you.
Peter Neumann, whose ACM Risks Forum for years has been pointing out that we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. You've done a fabulous job on characterizing the physical problems. For this audience, I think one of the comments that should follow from your holistic observation that you really have to look at the whole system would be that the articulation between the physical security and the so-called cyber security is itself not trustworthy. You have computer systems you can't trust, networking you can't trust, and physical controls that you can't trust with people who are subject to a lot of social engineering. How do you think about the holistic problem of integrating in some tight, trustworthy way the physical controls and the logical computer controls?
Well, that's a really good question. This whole convergence issue about how physical and cybersecurity come together is really a tough one. I mean, of course, it's often called the thugs versus the nerds problem. I think at the core of it is a cultural problem between the cybersecurity people and the physical security people. This is the reason I tried to suggest we could learn from each other, because those cultures are so incredibly different. For example, if you're a computer hacker and they arrest you and you go to jail, when you get out, you can start your six-figure consulting business, and everybody in cybersecurity will take benefit from what you've learned. If you work in physical security and you're convicted of a crime, you'll never work in physical security again, even as a consultant. Completely different mentality. So I think the first thing to do is try to figure out how these two cultures can work together. And they really intrinsically hate each other, and they have to understand the jobs that each does and come to appreciate the skills that each can offer. And I think a lot of this is really, if you had a good HR department, which nobody has, would be the classic place to bring these people together and have a discussion about what the frustrations of their job is, what it's really like. Again, I think there are certain aspects of cyber that are very well done, the customer focus, the focus on productivity. And there's certain things about physical security. They do understand people better than you cyber geeks. So, everybody should be using their strengths. And I think that might help partially. But there's also a huge problem with physical security in terms of vulnerabilities. Let's say you discover a software bug. Now, typically, there's some disagreement. Basically, everybody agrees you probably should quietly go to the software manufacturer, give them a chance to fix the problem. If they don't, then you go public and try to pressure them into fixing it. Well, that's fine for cyber because everybody can quickly download the patch and we're good to go. But with physical security, you've got a lot of indirect integrators. And if you find a vulnerability, there's no simple software download that fixes that in physical security. So if it's software, yes, maybe there is. But when there's a vulnerability with the hardware, you've got some real problems fixing it. You may not even be able to fix it in a realistic time frame. So again, it's a completely different environment. And I think if you're trying to look holistically at issues of convergence, you really have to understand how the two types of security are the same, but also how they're different.
Hi, Matt Blaze. I really enjoyed your talk. I was especially impressed by your voting machine attack, in which you routed the button for one candidate to the vote of another and still displayed the correct indicator light. I couldn't help but think, though, that there's a much easier attack against that system in which you just replace the piece of paper with the candidate names next to each button.
Yes, and in fact, here's the great thing. Most municipalities, they publish the list of candidates in a fixed order, so you know 2 weeks in advance exactly which candidates are going to be where. The thing is, I suggested the voter could do this attack. That's not really how it would work. The way this attack would happen is that typically municipalities deliver the voting machines a week or two in advance. Nobody signs for them. They sit in the church basement or the elementary gymnasium, typically unlocked, just sitting there. But also you've got the low-bid trucking companies that haul these things around. No one's accounting for them. You can keep them for a week. Nobody would miss them. And then typically at the warehouses, they have lousy security. So you really wouldn't attack it as a voter, but for dramatic purposes, I suggest that you could. But it's more to your question.
So I'm just wondering if the ultimately this boils down to requiring a defense against counterfeiting of the voting machine input surface, right? And so now we're also dealing with evidence of authenticity displayed to the voter, which seems like an extremely lopsided security equation that favors the attacker.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, the obvious thing is if the machine's powered up and somebody on the voter's end is opening up and reaching on the insides, the machine ought to be aware of that. I mean, some effort ought to be made to go, wait a minute, that's not okay. Now, how you protect the machine when it's not powered up is problematic. But it's interesting to note that this particular voting machine has a big, serious lead-acid battery. It's got some serious power behind it. It could monitor its own security even when not operating in a voting environment, though it doesn't. So I think the obvious thing is, at least make some effort so that you can't, while the machine is live and powered up and voting is taking place, reach inside and fiddle with it. This would seem to me to be just common sense. The other thing that a lot of municipalities do is randomize the orders of the candidates. Don't publish in advance the fixed order so that you wouldn't know going in necessarily where each candidate appeared on the ballot.
Thank you kindly for the excellent presentation. Actually, 2 quick questions. In the case where there is a breach in whatever manner, whether it's physical or cybersecurity, do people in charge get fired? Is my first question, very simply, as from your understanding? And secondly, the question, given that you've mentioned that many other physical securities are so lame in terms of their design, do you see a great market out there for really well done, physical securities in terms of new products that could come to market? Thank you kindly.
Well, in terms of new products, no. Customers are happy with the junk they're getting. There's no... And some companies come to us and they go, look, we understand what we're selling isn't very good, and we understand you guys could help make it a lot better. We just can't afford it because no one's asking for it. So if someday we start to get customers saying we want some real security on a security product, I mean, what a concept, then they're interested. But no, the problem is really the customer. The customer's happy with crap, and in the case of tamper-indicating seals, 2% of all U.S. cargo is stolen, and we all pay for that. Many times the people who use seals on trucks and transporters and rail cars are made to put on a seal by the insurance company. They don't really care. The 2% loss is covered, so they're not interested in good security. So until somebody says, gee, I really want a seal that has some probability of actually detecting a surreptitious attack, we're not going to have good seals. So I think fundamentally that's the problem. In terms of the firing, people don't get fired for vulnerabilities. They only get fired for security incidents. Typically security incidents that weren't their fault and which they couldn't do anything about. Classic example is most companies, when there's product tampering, as there inevitably will be, fires the chief security officer. Right at the time when they need the best security advice, they get rid of the person who had no way really of preventing tampering because the organization would never have funded any attempts to be serious about product tampering. So it's, again, I think cyber is more sophisticated. I think when there are security incidents in cyber, the first thing out of the CEO's mouth isn't who do we fire, but when there's a physical security incident, it often is.